Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us all today. I'm Hillary Andrews, the Senior Director of Science Policy and Strategy at Friends of Cancer Research. Recently, at the Friends of Cancer Research 2025 annual meeting held on November 4th, we had experts from academia, industry, regulatory bodies, and patient advocacy communities who gathered to deep dive into three critical topics: seamless trial designs for rare cancers, determining contribution of effect for combination therapies, and selecting the right comparator arm in multi-regional clinical trials. Today, we'll unpack some of the themes of the working groups through the lens of patient advocacy, how we can ensure that trial design, policy decisions, and regulatory frameworks are informed by the lived experience of patients and their caregivers, as well as how the patient advocates included here engaged in the working groups and the lessons they learned. We hope you took some time to review the annual meeting materials, but if you didn't, we'll spend some time reviewing the key takeaways from each topic. Today during our webinar, we wanted to try a new approach, including a question box. And so please let us know if you reviewed any of the material that we shared using the question box that should be on your screen right now. We'll spend the first half of the webinar focusing on the annual meeting topics and advocates' involvement. Then we'll have time for questions from the audience. So please provide your questions for our advocates using the question box below. One of our goals for today is to provide patient advocates with a forum for learning more about the patient advocate involvement at Friends annual meeting and for asking questions about the topics, allowing us to engage with the patient advocate community about the importance of these topics and hear their perspectives. Our panelists today are Friends advisory advocates. Our advisory advocates are patients, caregivers of patients, and survivors of cancer who provide invaluable insights on their experiences to ensure patient perspectives are represented in Friends' work. They volunteer to serve as project members on Friends projects and are also included as panelists at Friends meetings. They attend quarterly meetings with our staff to learn more about updates on Friends projects, discuss upcoming events, and share community needs. You can learn more about them using the link that's been posted. And now I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So Misha, if you'll kick us off.
Thank you, Hillary. Hi, everyone. I'm Misha Mehta. I am a scientist by training, a board certified patient advocate, and most importantly, mother to my beloved brain tumor angel, Neve. I serve as a senior director of research at the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, where I lead the research initiatives and cross-sector collaborations to accelerate discoveries and expand clinical trial access. I'm also the founder and president of Neve Colte and Brave Ronald Foundation, where we partner with families, researchers, policymakers to advance rare cancer research and break down data silos that slows progress. My advocacy work spans from the White House Cancer Moonshot to serving as a rare disease legislative advisor with the Every Life Foundation and on multiple advisory boards with such as Coalition Against Childhood Cancer, Friends of Cancer Research, Patient Centered Outcome Research Institute, and the Department of Defense as a peer review program. Across all of this work, my purpose is simple: to ensure no families walk this journey alone and to build research and policy infrastructures that delivers hope for families today while creating cures for tomorrow. Everything I do is fueled by my son Neve's legacy and the urgent need for reform, how we approach pediatric brain cancer research. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Hillary. I'm Kristen McJunkins. I'm a stage 3 melanoma survivor. I was diagnosed in 2008 and then was also a caregiver for my mom, who died of an aggressive lymphoma in 2017. I joined Friends as an advocate in 2022 and have served on a few of their working groups, most recently the multi-regional clinical trials that we'll discuss today. Additionally, I'm actively involved with the Melanoma Research Foundation, Blood Cancer United, and have served as a consumer reviewer with both the MRF and the CDMRP. Happy to be here.
Hello, I'm Susan Rouse, and I am a nurse who's been a patient advocate for 40 years. And then I was diagnosed with melanoma in 2022, and I became active in the Melanoma Research Foundation and have served as a grant reviewer, and I'm a member of the review team for Sun Aware Curriculum K through 12. I've also been a grant reviewer for the American Brain Tumor Association, and I've been a Friends of Cancer Research Advisory Advocate for 1 year. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carol Villette, and I became a cancer advocate in 2008 after my diagnosis of breast cancer in 2007. And I was really looking for a way to support cancer research and give back to help with promoting new discoveries and treatments, since I know I benefited from many of those when I had my surgery and my treatment. Since that time, I become a member of Komen Advocates in Science. I've been a reviewer for the CDMRP. I also review for the program in Texas, CPRIT, and I've become a research advocacy member for advisory advocate member for Friends of Cancer Research about 4 years ago. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris White. I'm a stage 4 mucosal melanoma survivor diagnosed in July of 2018. After 18 months of doing every treatment possible, I eventually was able to get into a clinical trial for TIL therapy and received my infusion in January 2020. In less than a year, it completely eradicated all of my cancer, been cancer-free ever since. I'm now an author, a speaker, and full-time advocate. I'm a CDMRP grant reviewer, NCI steering committee patient advocate member, and have been involved with Friends of Cancer Research since 2023 as a part of their advisory advocate committee, and also involved with the MRF as their Southwest representative for their advocacy board. And pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everybody. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about each of the topics. Let's start at the top with the seamless trial designs for rare cancer development. We do have a link that we're going to share with everyone because we wanted to share a figure. So if you'll click on that link, I think it's slide 3, it just gives an overview of what a seamless trial design looks like. And so Misha, what are some of the key takeaways from being part of the working group and from the white paper? What is a seamless trial? How can it help when we're studying drugs for patients with rare cancers? And why does this topic matter for patients?
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. For me, the biggest key takeaway from the Seamless Clinical Trial Design Working Group and the white paper that came out of it is that seamless trials are not just a technical improvement; they are a moral one. A seamless trial is essentially a single continuous study that integrates what we traditionally separate into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, instead of starting, instead of losing time, losing data. A seamless trial allows dose finding, dose optimization, cohort expansion, early phase assessment to all flow into one protocol. So think about, like, it could be in multiple different ways. You could group phase 1 and phase 2 together, or you could do phase 2 or phase 3 together, or you could have a seamless trial starting from phase 1 all the way to phase 3. And that just is like really makes the protocol very efficient. What I learned in this group is just how powerful this concept is for rare cancers. In rare cancers, and I can speak, especially for pediatric brain tumors, we don't have the luxury of hundreds of patients or years between each phases. Every patient is precious, and every data point carries a significant amount of weight. In a traditional model, early phase participations are often treated as dose finding cases that don't necessarily contribute to the later stage evidence. But seamless clinical trial design flips that narrative. They honor the contribution of every single patient. Their safety, biology, and early response becomes part of the learning engine that moves the therapy forward. For families like mine, that matters significantly. We did not have the luxury of time for inefficiency. Most families don't, and the disease moves faster than our archaic, trial design structures. So a seamless approach respects that urgency. It allows the real time adaptation, opening of newer cohorts, refining doses, expanding promising signals without shutting down and restarting. And because everything happens within a unified framework, you save a lot of resources, and that the evidence that is generated is much more cleaner, more interpretable, as well as more useful for regulators. And you asked what stood out for working in this group is not about the speed, it's also about the partnership. These trials work best when patients and advocates are involved right at the start, helping define what meaningful outcomes look like, what burdens are acceptable, and how flexibility should be built in right early on. And what it means for rare cancer patients is because seamless trials offer something incredibly rare in our field. The scientific rigor that moves faster, wastes less, and treats each patient's participations as invaluable. It's a model that gives families hope today while building stronger cures for tomorrow. And families facing disease that just don't wait, it's not innovation, right? That's respect and that's contribution for every single person that is mattered.
Thanks, Misha. One thing we didn't start out with was kind of explaining how this all works. So Friends hosts working groups for the weeks and months leading into our annual meeting. And so all the folks here today were part of those working groups that included academics, industry representatives, people from government, who all had conversations about these topics to lead towards the white papers. So we met on a biweekly cadence for about 5 months leading up to the annual meeting. And each person here was part of one of those working groups. Misha was part of the Seamless, and our other person was Chris. So Chris, do you have any thoughts about your experience in the working group and anything that you took away from it?
Yeah, this was, I believe, my second or third working group I've been a part of with Friends of Cancer Research, and my specific type of cancer is known as an ultra rare type of cancer, being of the subtype, and so having multiple different layers from pharmaceutical and industry and clinical and science, and then other patient perspectives. Someone with a rare subtype is always trying to find a place to, I guess, essentially to fit in. So to kind of mirror a lot of what Misha said, it was very unique to see the conversation, collaborate on a somewhat even basis every couple of weeks to get the different opinions and figure out, or at least try to bring the conversation to what we can do to include more rare patients and to make it more, I guess, in quote, seamless. And so there's, when you have a subtype or a rare or an ultra rare type of cancer, there's not always a lot of options. And so being able to kind of, I guess, in words like streamline, how to be able to access or be able to be involved and have that data further relate, but it's all about reducing that timeline. And so this, I think, is definitely an additional step to doing so.
Thanks, Chris. Let's shift gears, talk about our combination drug development group. Carol was one of the representatives for that group. What are some of the takeaways you have from being part of that working group and from the white paper?
Well,
Why is it important? Oh, sorry. Why is it important to understand the contribution of effect, and why does this matter for patients?
Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, it was really an exciting group to be a part of and lots of new learning for me. But, when we talk about combination therapies, I think many cancer patients hear about that and are treated in a combination. And different drugs, the great thing about combination treatments, different drugs can target different molecular pathways, and that leads to improved outcomes. And there's a lot of examples of those, especially in immune therapy. But every drug carries the potential of exposing patients to harmful toxicities. And that's why it's really important to understand what is it contributing to on the positive side? What is it contributing to a cure or treatment? And that's called the contribution of effect, or the COE. And especially when it leads to better outcomes, we want to be sure that that's available to patients, but we need to prove that that's happening. So often 1, 2, 3 drugs or so may be combined together, but in order to prove that COE, we need to have a trial. And to have a really robust trial to prove this would involve, at least if you have 2 drugs, at least 4 arms. So drug A, drug B, drug A and B together, and then a control arm. And as you can imagine, that becomes complicated. It takes more time, more money, way more patients. And as we've just heard from both Misha and Chris, time is of the essence. We cannot have wonderfully designed gold standard trials that may take years, while meanwhile people are waiting for treatment, and we're losing people. People are dying because they don't have access to that. So this panel looked at ways to consider some alternate trial designs, not making shortcuts or cutting corners, and again, not exposing people to toxicities unnecessarily, but where it makes sense to do that. And some of the ideas and examples that we discussed were considering things such as some relaxed standards, looking at drugs that have already been used with perhaps in another disease setting, looking at rare diseases as an example of drugs that may have been used for successful treatment, using other endpoints that are more relevant to patients, using patient reported outcomes, and some of these other relaxed standards. And this really matters to patients because we need to be sure that patients are protected from unnecessary toxicities, but are also not unduly burdened with very complicated trial designs. And I think it was just a wonderful thing right from the beginning that we really said that patients should be at the center of what we discuss, that patient centricity was so important. And I think ensuring patients that when they're randomized in a trial, that this is for their best interest, there will be no harm, and only new knowledge and benefit can come from that. And that we need to put the focus, someone in one of the last panels made the comment that time is money, but time is life. And I think that's what's so important about this, is that, again, the urgency of being able to prove what treatments are contributing to effect, and how this can benefit patients without any harm.
Thanks,
Those
Carol.
basic takeaways.
Lots of information. Thank you very much. And lastly, we had our control arm selection for multi-regional clinical trials discussion. So Kristen, what are some of the key takeaways from being part of that working group in the white paper? Why is control arm selection for multi-regional clinical trials challenging? And why does this topic matter for patients?
Sure. Yeah. It's when I was diagnosed in 2008, I didn't qualify for a clinical trial. And, for melanoma back then, it was mostly people that were stage 4 or metastatic that were qualifying for clinical trials. And so when drugs started to come on the market a few years later, that's when I really became interested in the clinical trial process. But then, all these years later, being part of this group, I don't think most patients would understand that trials can vary by country and even by regions within a country. And, again, I know I didn't even understand that until our discussions, really got going. So, when patients are presented with information about clinical trials, I think it's, so important that decisions, about their treatment probably need to be made relatively quickly. And so for caregivers and physicians to be transparent and clear about what's happening and how the trial operates is, really of utmost importance. So the patient and their families or whoever's supporting them can make informed decisions. And I think in partnership with the physicians is, really a critical piece as well about whether or not they want to join the trial.
Thank you. Susan, do you have anything to add? You're also part of that working group.
Yes, thank you, Hillary. So, as we've said and sort of talked about, these topics are really hard to wrap your head around because there are so many aspects of care affected at the same time, from standards of care to regulatory approvals and everything in between when you're talking about clinical trials. And so then when you're looking at a global stage where every area has a different maybe regulatory system to go through or a standard of care, that oncology treatment, you want to, for the oncology treatments, you want to have a standard of care that reflects the current treatment and is modifiable based on clinical benefit. And so Carol touched on this a little bit. We said that, or what we discussed is that we wanted to be able to modify, and then how does that actually happen? Because it's not really always feasible changing that standard of care midstream, and that requires flexibility and also transparency. And so that we can really say to, and we did have, I saw somebody already popped up a question about FDA. We did have FDA, people from FDA on our working group. And although it was a little bit disrupted with the government shutdown, they were able to say, that these are things that they're talking about and having discussions about too, and that they're really trying to look at this and try to decide how or where, things can change a little bit to sort of make this a little bit better. Because we don't want any of those patients to get suboptimal care if they're assigned to that arm of the clinical trial where the standard of care becomes obsolete. And some of the industry partners were able to identify some of those clinical trials that had become obsolete, and we were still giving care to those people. And sort of the end product of that is not always a good thing. So that's something that was really, really helpful to sort of understand in the group.
Amazing. Thank you. So three pretty complicated topics. We heard some overlap. I think patient centricity was at the middle of a lot of that. We heard some comments about endpoints. We heard some comments about how time is of the essence. But let's just spend a little bit of time reflecting kind of on your experience in the working group, as well as any thoughts you might have about kind of the overlap of the different projects or where might next steps be. Susan, will you just share some of your thoughts about being in the working group?
Yes, so I feel like it was fascinating, and I was super impressed with the people that came to the table because they were all very knowledgeable of their, industry or academia, and they all had so much to give to the group, which was really nice. And then I feel like we were really able to move that needle forward regarding the standard of care variability, but they still need to continue to work on it. It's not something that's going to be resolved in a minute or half a minute. And so we need to really work on that to continue to benefit patients. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. What about you, Carol?
Well, I also was just extremely impressed with the panel of really smart, hardworking, thoughtful, and caring people that Friends is able to recruit to be on this panel. And they came from, various pharmaceutical manufacturers, the FDA, the NCI, academia, and of course, I was on it as an advocate, as was another person or two, I believe. And it was really just an amazing process to see us with Hillary's leadership really going from, thoughts to a fully fleshed out paper. But what really impressed me the most was at the very first meeting, one of the members, and it wasn't me, said, everything we do and everything we talk about should be patient centric, should have patient centricity. And it really became, I think, I look at it as like our North Star for direction and guidance and where we went with that. Because as much as, and I had a lot to learn on combinations. I really didn't know anything about it. So of course, Google Scholar and PubMed and things like that became my good friend because I would need to go look up some terms and try to educate myself on that, which is all possible. And people were very open to questions and answering my questions. And I always felt, welcomed in the group. But what was utmost reassuring to me with this group was that we talk about contribution effect and different ways to, do trials and, shorten things and so on. And then one of the regulators would say, remember, you have to prove that. You have to prove that what that contribution of effect is. It's not good enough just talk about it. It's got to be proved. So I always felt that was really just, the safety and protection mechanism for patients, because I think that's what we all want. We want to know if we're going to take a drug or be in a trial, that we're going to be protected, and that's going to be, the outcome will be something that stands on science and is proven. So I just thought it was a wonderful experience from so many points of view.
Thanks, Carol. How about you, Chris?
One of the biggest takeaways that I had wasn't specifically with the group that I was in, but the one that I wasn't in. And this was for group number 2. And with combination, treatments, talking about the safety for patients. And the thought just to come across, and I've had this in other discussions about, being proactive with, potential, adverse like side effects, and, what is going on that can be done to stay ahead of those, and just that topic of conversation, um, both within, the oncology realm and also the patients, on being proactive rather than reactive. For example, like if you're on a combination immunotherapy, and one of the side effects is maybe you might, get a severe case of colitis, there's some oncologists out there that are proactively prescribing, you know, the steroids, so you can stay ahead of it instead of getting behind it and having to catch up. And so the topic of safety, and patient transicity, and keeping that the focus, and making sure that they're healthy enough to continue with that, like, just really rang a huge bell with me.
Thanks, Chris. Kristen, how about you?
So I don't have a scientific background, but I always find the working group discussions so fascinating. And, from a patient and advocate perspective, I realize how complicated it is for the professionals in industry, FDA, academia, clinicians that are working in it, just, based on their discussions and seeing them going back and forth and bringing up different points. But they're genuineness and dedication to what we're all saying, that about keeping things patient centric, really comes through in that conversation as well, even when they're in the weeds trying to figure out which direction to go in. And so like Carol, I spend a lot of time looking up different terms that are being said, just so I can understand afterwards. But it really comes to light how many factors there are to consider when trials are being designed, to provide not just good data, but, patient safety and, efficacy in the process, especially when science is changing so quickly. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. And Misha, what about you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the advocates have already covered, some of my reflections as well. But I think in addition to that, one thing that really struck me while working in this group, and this was my first time being part of such a diverse, multi-stakeholder working group, is that the sense of urgency and the purpose, right? They're all coming with the same sense of urgency. The pharmaceutical companies, the FDA representatives, and the patient advocates, we did not align most of the time, but everybody understood that the rare cancer patients don't have time to waste. And it's that urgency that kind of like brought the group together. The pharma bought like all the operational expertise. The FDA got offered guidelines on like regulatory pathways, like what needs to happen, also by on the same time by staying open for innovation. And the advocates, we brought the reality that delays are just not about months on a timeline, right? There are families that are actually running out of options. So both as a scientist and a mother, I could speak that the rigor we need and the urgency we felt was all around the working group. The most powerful realization was that the barriers in the seamless trials aren't about unwillingness, right? It's about uncertainty. And this working group created a shared language, real world examples, and frameworks that give everyone confidence to move forward. And when diverse stakeholders align around patient centricity, patient urgency, we can innovate together. And that's what we saw in the working group, that we were all willing to really push the needle forward to do what is right by the patients.
Amazing. Thank you. And how about something you learned? So more like on a content side. What's one thing that you learned about being on your working group, and how you would kind of think about that maybe into your advocacy moving forward, or the things that you might take away with you as well? Carol, what about you?
Well, kind of to emphasize this really very careful balance that I learned from the researchers that were in my group, between research progress, which we all want, but yet patient protection. And that there was wasn't anyone who was, taking that lightly, that was very, very important. But I also learned a word that I didn't know, which was equipoise. I think I'm saying it right, equipoise. And that is the concept or the ethical principle that there needs to be in a clinical trial real uncertainty about that the randomization can happen without harming anyone or knowing that one drug or one avenue of treatment is better than the other. And that was something I hadn't heard before. And I've been in clinical trials and I've read about them, and I don't know how I ever missed that, but that was something I went and read a lot more about. And it just gives a very reassuring when that researcher brought that up in the discussion, that when there is a clinical trial, there really is not a certain path to go down. It is discovering new knowledge, and that people can feel assured when they're randomized into a group that we really don't know what the outcome will be. So that was my big takeaway.
That's a great one, Carol. I do think that's a term that we often are using in the conversations we have, but I think it's one I learned probably since I've been at Friends too. Just this idea that if we have enough data to show that one of the arms is actually not going to be more beneficial or could be harmful, that you're not going to enroll patients on that. So it's the data that supports our understanding of the two arms that supports decisions about whether that arm would be included or not. For example, in our, combination discussions, if you're going after making sure that there's clinical equipoise. So thanks for bringing that one up. That's a great one. How about you, Kristen?
Yeah, no, I really learned how important lines of communication are, definitely between providers, regulatory bodies, and patients. It was very clear in the discussions, decisions aren't made in a vacuum. And I think sometimes on the patient side, especially if you're not understanding, you might think that it's happening, but it's really not. And that, to everyone's point about the safety and keeping the patient centric, that there are so many factors to consider when moving treatments forward to the next phase or on to eventual approval.
Awesome. Thank you. Susan.
So, since I've been a nurse for so long, I've worked for a long time and still work and know people who feel like they've never had access to a clinical trial that have had, disease processes, breast cancer, glioblastoma, those sorts of things. And I think that the one thing I learned in our group is that those clinical trials, even if the standard of care is out there and it doesn't feel like you're really in a clinical trial, you're still getting the benefit of that no matter what. And that's globally. That's not just, in the Midwest or in California or whatever. That is something that we look at across the world. And that's really important to me because of my family members and friends and people I know who have been diagnosed with cancer, they still are getting the benefit of those clinical trials even though they aren't actually enrolled in one. Thank you.
Great one. Yeah, of course. Misha.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I learned is that good science and speeds are not opposing forces, right? They are partners when trial designs are done thoughtfully. Coming into this, I carry like a lot of fear that Carol was talking about, right? Many, like we have, if we are pushing for faster trials, are we like compromising on safety and rigor? But sitting with, the pharmaceutical scientists who spent decades, right, optimizing clinical trial design and the FDA reviewers who explain what evidence they actually truly need versus what's just tradition, I realized that we've been accepting delays that don't actually make trials better. But I also learned something equally important, that there are genuine opportunities for patient advocates and a lived experience in developing these trials. We understand what endpoints actually matter, not just survival, right? But quality of life, symptom burden, what treatments are tolerable, right? The flux between tolerability and acceptability, and we can identify what adaptive features make sense from a patient's perspective, from expanding cohorts that show promise, like, Hillary, you were talking about, or stopping a dose level that causes unbearable side effects. So I am like deeply thankful for Friends of Cancer Research for giving advocates like me a place at this table, right? Not just as an observer, but as true partners whose voice is shaping, the white paper that came out of it. And that realization changed how I advocate. I am not asking anybody to cut corners, but I'm asking them to eliminate the corners that need not be there. And then let's work together. Let's build a blueprint for trials that work for patients with patients.
Amazing. Thank you. And Chris, any thoughts on this one? Any thoughts on something you might have learned from your working group?
Yeah, like the landscape in oncology as a whole is transforming like so fast, like all the time. It's extremely hard to keep up with. And so being able to like be a part of it and then cross connect with other patients and other people that are working on other diseases and forms in oncology is just super educational because it's real time, and that's literally, I believe, like the answer to a lot of the problems is it's hard to keep up with so much within such little time frames that by the time you get to it or understand what's going on with the clinical trial or the standard of care, that could have changed. And so having multiple different stakeholders and everybody from the clinical side to the science side to having a patient voice, and so that was just another huge takeaway that I took from being a part of this, and that's something that Friends provides. It's extremely important and very informative.
Thanks, Chris. So the Seamless Trial Designs white paper outlined the importance of including the patient voice in clinical trial design. We've heard some about how it was helpful to be part of this working group, but how might patient advocates go about getting involved more in clinical trial design? Does anybody have experience with supporting clinical trial designs? And maybe Misha, I'll start with you since you were on the working group that kind of had the conversations. I know I remember hearing a lot from you during those conversations.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Hillary, for that question. In my experience, the most meaningful way advocates influence clinical trial designs is by engaging, right? Engaging before the protocols are finalized. Like, think about like even getting before the trials is at the imagining steps, right? Include patient advocates at right at the inception, and that early involvement lets us bring us like lived realities and what outcome matters more, what burdens are manageable, like themes that we've been talking about throughout, right, in this 30 minutes. But practically, there are like, I would think that there are three ways, right? Like, start showing up early, right? Or be part of those concept discussions. Second, like, let's translate lived experience into design choices. Can family handle weekly visits, or how does fatigue affect school, right? In my case, for my son, what does meaningful improvement look like for a child, right? If he wasn't like swallowing, and now after being on a treatment he's swallowing, whereas there is no difference in the tumor size, that is a meaningful outcome. These insights shape dosing decisions and and early endpoint rules. And the last thing is like we're shifting the tone of the room, and I think everybody's like covered this, right? In protocol review meetings with the FDA, advocates can ask like prompt questions like, is this burden fair, right? Is this endpoint meaningful? Can we adapt sooner so patients are not stuck in an inefficient therapy? We bring the context that data alone cannot. Sometimes benefit looks like walking or swallowing is an example that I told you. So we've already, at least in the pediatric brain tumor space, we've already seen that involving patients early enough has made significant approvals. We've got 2 drug approvals so far for pediatric brain tumors. One was very recently in August of this year, which was Modeso, recently approved that use patients' perspective not only in development of the drug, but also they were present in the FDA meeting to kind of translate what this data cannot alone do, right? And the second was Ojemda. That was the first FDA drug approved for pediatric low-grade glioma. it became a reality because families and foundations, nonprofit organizations unite around unmet need and push for this targeted opportunities. So including patient voices, is absolutely critical. And there are many different ways a patient advocate can get involved. I think it's just a matter of showing up and speaking what your lived experience is. And Friends is giving a wonderful platform for us to do something like this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the lived experience part is such an important part. We were chatting a little bit before we hopped on about, everyone here might have somewhat of a scientific background, but what they definitely have is that lived experience, and that's really the important thing. You don't necessarily have to have the scientific background. Carol, did you have any thoughts on this one? And then we can see if anybody else did.
Yeah, I neglected to mention in my intro because it's still a new appointment for me, but I was appointed to our local cancer center in Vermont to the Trial Protocol Review and Monitoring Committee. And I managed to make a meeting or two so far. And it's been really interesting because even in my brief attendance, I was able to help give patient input. And I'm not the only patient. There's someone else also, patient advocate on the group, about a trial that was proposed that involved imaging quite frequently over a period of, I don't know, I think it was 12 weeks or so. And it's like, you need to think about that patient burden. Especially in a state like this, we're a rural state, it's not unusual for people to need to drive 100 miles one way to go to a cancer center where they could have this done. And that's just not patient friendly, something like that. And I related back to my own experience. I dropped out of a trial that I was in because it was set up for 5 years and I needed to get an injection once a month and it was in the chemotherapy room. And it was just like every month when that rolled around, not to mention my schedule, but it was like a PTSD encounter almost going back to the same place. And I think there's no reason why some of this cannot be moved out to the community also, rather than returning to the same place where you were years ago for the same treatment. So anyway, so that's my own personal experience. But I also found with advocacy, the reason I ended up on this group is that one thing leads to another, leads to another. And the only thing when I first was diagnosed and I was at a conference and somebody from CDMRP was there recruiting people, I said, I would love to do that. I mean, I think everybody, when you've been through cancer or you've seen a loved one go through, you want to give back or move the science ahead. And that's how I felt. And it's really been a series of connections that led to meeting other people, that led to other work. And there's people who are way more involved than I am. But that's how I ended up on this committee also, because I was working with Komen and there was a researcher and now he's on, and et cetera. So I'd say just start somewhere, join a group, become active, educate yourself a little bit. And I think once you put that out to the universe, that it will happen. If you want to get involved in trials, you will definitely find a welcome spot for yourself.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? I do want to shift gear. Chris, go ahead. You unmuted.
I was just going to say, Carol hit the nail on the head with that one. Like, I couldn't agree more with everything she just said, especially about, getting involved with a trial. If you're like in a state, that's pretty rural and you're having to go back for your follow-ups on location, that is very burdensome on a patient and that, and their family or anyone else involved. And, I don't see why there's any reason why there couldn't be an initiative that's taken to where a patient could be able to do a lot of those follow-ups like locally and kind of take away some of that burden that would engage more involvement. But that comes all back to the patient, centricity thing of, the best source literally comes from those that have lived it rather than, a data point on a poster. And so, Carol, I just wanted to mirror what you said. You did great. And you know, that's literally what I was wanting to highlight.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that idea of kind of the local sites is conversations that are ongoing. I think, it's the same thing. Like, I think Kristen did a great job of highlighting some of those challenges, the pushes and pulls, and, ensuring that there's trained folks to collect the data and the way the clinical trial requests, even though, you might get a blood pressure reading from like one machine, but the machine for the trial is this. And so how do you make sure that that machine is appropriate, and that's just like one of the many, many, many tests that may be done. So I think there's lots of conversation in this space around kind of how to improve, having trials come to people's where they live as well. But let's shift gears. So we do have a few questions from the audience that are coming through. One of them is, how is tolerability being considered in combination regimens? I think it's a point for us to kind of highlight that we didn't necessarily focus in that working group on safety. The focus was on contribution of effect. And so we were trying to kind of look more at the how effective the drugs were, and the safety piece was kind of part of the totality of evidence that would go into it. We did touch on the idea of how patient-reported outcomes can support an understanding tolerability. That's work that Friends has done previously, is looking at how to include PROs as a measure of tolerability that's above and beyond just safety. But just wanted to answer that question and mention that. There's a question here. It's directed for Kristen, but kind of interested to hear if anybody else knows anything. Were there conversations about how AI is helping enforce lines of communications across specialties to help in patient care?
That didn't, I don't know if Susan has different memories, but it didn't come up in our group. But I think it is a really interesting conversation, particularly, as we're talking about trying to keep things patient-centric. And I think a lot of these conversations are leading to past working groups talking about the like pragmatic clinical trials. And, that might be a space where AI, I mean, maybe this ends up being a working group someday, thinking about how some of that coordination could happen, because I think that's, part of the challenges, particularly in the US, just of, our healthcare system and so many different bodies talking or not talking to each other, but then the rules even between states. And, I know it's come up like since COVID, particularly in Medicare, where there was the allowance of, remote doctor's visits, but, since then that has gone away, or physicians actually need to be licensed to practice, in the different states if they were going to have a remote visit. And but kind of coming back to, making it easier for patients. Maybe that is a place where AI can help.
Thanks. There was another question about whether the working groups are going to continue. So these topics, working groups, at this point are mostly completed. Our working groups for annual meeting happen each year, but our advisory advocates really are the ones that we kind of work with to identify the folks who would join. So we shared our advisory advocate link above. And so if you're interested in learning more about them, there's plenty of information on the website. So please take a look at that. Anyone have any comments? In the working groups, were there any conversations that we had about clinical trial inclusivity and decentralizing trials? We kind of just talked a little bit about decentralizing, but inclusivity. Were there any thoughts from the group on conversations related to that?
I can't recall the specific conversation of when it came up, but I know it's come up in a handful of the calls, and I've also had it come up in multiple other different areas that I'm involved with, and uh, it's uh, it's been more prevalent to try to find like a middle ground instead of having like a full centralized or decentralized, but trying to make steps to being able to have like I guess it would be called like a hybrid of a decentralized I guess model, to where it could start providing access without just having it be completely black and white, like there is a middle ground. But it's like a continuing conversation that I see happen all the time, and I'm seeing models of it pop up quite regularly. So don't have like a specific call I can trace it back to, but it comes up in all of our working group calls, I'm sure. And I can definitely see it coming up in our future ones, especially in our, I guess it would be the May next gen cell therapies meeting. I would hope that that's one of the topics.
I think for like decentralization, at least in the pediatric, space, because there are all the trials are primarily run at academic centers. They're not much industry sponsored trials. So one way what we do in the pediatric landscape is that you have to go for treatment or part of a clinical trial, and most often or not, you have to go across state boundaries, right? But what we can do is like blood work, like routine blood work. Can you do it at your home sites? I think what Carol was saying. But those are some of the opportunities that we are considering as in the pediatric landscape as how we are designing clinical trials, because we also want to make sure that you're giving some sense of normalcy to the child. Like, do you have some days in school versus no days in school, right? So what are correlative studies or correlative measurements that you can do away from the clinical trial sites, and how do we incorporate those early enough into as you design those clinical trials?
Absolutely. I think the other thing, is like, what other data can we use that, patients on clinical trials don't have to be the only source of data when you're making decisions. So we talked a little bit earlier about kind of thinking about prior clinical trial data. Another project that Friends has ongoing is about external control arms. And so could you use historical data from the real world data, or even from previously completed clinical trials, to develop a control arm based off of external data that is then compared, or maybe even as like a part of a control arm. So maybe you enroll your patients in a 1-to-2 fashion where 50% of the patients in the control arm are enrolled from that trial, and then 50% are from an external control arm. So there's a lot of different ways we can kind of think about this, and a lot of different approaches that are kind of under consideration. It all goes back to Carol's initial, one of Carol's comments earlier, though, that idea of balancing innovation and science and moving the next direction, and ensuring that we have patient safety and that we have patients, minds at kind of the center of all of it. Well, maybe we'll move towards final thoughts. We do have a question for our audience. We'd like to receive feedback on this webinar. Let us know what you like, what you'd like to see in the future. So if you could fill that out, it would be great. But I'll ask the group. So kind of last thoughts as you have. One of the things that could be helpful too is just, if you had somebody who'd never really worked with an advocacy before, or maybe they just got started and they're trying to figure out next steps, what are some piece of advice that you might give them? What are some pieces of advice that you received or that you wish you had known at the time? But I'll just kind of open it up and see who has options, or who has ideas for that.
I can kick off here, right? As we were all doing introduction, one unifying theme that I saw between all the patient advocates on the screen is that we all at some level are CDMRP peer reviewers, right? So I think like that could be that's like an for me, it's part of my healing. That's how I got into that. But I think that could be a really good starting point to get yourself into what it looks like reviewing scientific literature, but being truly from a consumer standpoint of view, and being in those conversations, you have an opportunity to not only review by yourself, but then in a working group, the scientists explain the concept to you, and then you can revise your reviewing. So it's like an iterative process that's you're learning. And I think that would be like a really good first step. And they're always looking for reviewers.
And that is through DoD, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to give a little? I know you kind of explained the process, but what is the intention behind like you're in that setting? You're every single one has a patient advocate reviewer, right? Is that?
Yes. So it's called like a peer reviewer. So you come in as a peer reviewer and you have to have lived experience or like a caregiver experience, or you're going to be a patient yourself. And it's not that you get to like I only review pediatric brain tumor, proposals that come in. I'm not going to review a breast cancer one because that's not my lived experience in that. So they kind of like tailor you into what your lived experience is or what you're patient of. I think there are people who are more experienced on this. So I'll stop and I'll let others chime in here.
Misha, I just have a question. Is CDMRP meeting face-to-face for reviews, or is it online?
It is now, after COVID, it's all been virtual.
It's virtual.
Was just going to mention, in order to get into the CDMRP, you usually have to have a nominating organization nominate you to be a peer reviewer. You got to fill out the application process, and so that way you can show your lived experience and all that. But it's extremely insightful to be a part of that kind of review process and what's shaping the clinical trials and all of that. But it's extremely rewarding, and being able to help us as a part of that process. So you can go to the CDMRP website to check them out. But if you need to get involved with another organization that can hopefully nominate you and or find out another way to be able to get your foot in the door. So
Well,
That's a good point, Chris.
I would second Misha's idea that CDMRP was a common thread through all of our backgrounds. And the great thing about, even though I don't review with them, I haven't in several years, they do, at the time when I started, they provided every new reviewer with a mentor who was another advocate reviewer, experienced, who could, help you through the process the first time. And I found that very, very reassuring.
And additionally, I'm a reviewer, but I came to that later in my advocacy journey. I actually got more involved with Hill Days, so going to DC with the Melanoma Research Foundation, and more recently with the Rally for Medical Research, which was for all diseases, not just melanoma or cancer, but meeting with representatives, advocating for research funding, which I think in this day and age, this last year or two, is even more important than ever before. And, I've just found that so rewarding as well. And I think every association, whatever, cancer type you might have, probably has some type of Hill Day, whether you're meeting locally within your state or nationally down in DC.
And
One
after
other.
I retired, I'm sorry, Misha.
No,
But
go ahead,
after I
Susan.
retired, I was really, looking to up my advocacy game. And so that is, the best time to sort of jump in for me to really look and see where I could get involved. And it started with the Melanoma Research Foundation, but then led to a bunch of other things just from there. And that's what's really cool is once you kind of get involved, then you're able to just sort of snowball that.
Yeah, I was just saying one thing is that at least a lot of the grants right now, and I can speak primarily to in the pediatric landscape, they require patient advocates as part of their grant writing, as part of their proposals, right? So that would be if you have a relation with your treating doctor or who's a researcher scientist, ask them if they need a patient advocate to be part of their research proposal, and and sometimes even the clinical trialists need to have some sort of patient advocates a part of their IRB approval. That would be a good starting point to get involved into this.
Yep, very true.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much. Thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. Stay tuned for future events. Friends is hosting our next public meeting will be on February 5th about endpoints. We will have an advocate webinar after that one as well. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts about today's event and how we can kind of continue to improve these into the future. And we hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays. We'll talk to you soon.